Misadventures of an Escape Artist, Episode 3, First Flight. Only at the end of our first year did we learn to fly. After 15 hours of training, we could then have our first solo flight. My first airborne experience with an instructor was in early June. It was a 30-minute familiarity flight with Mr. Alain Baudouin. It was on a single-engine Beechcraft B-19 Musketeer. Mr. Baudouin was a good man, encouraging and interested in teaching the rudiments of flying. I cringe when I think of my second instructor, Mr. Gerald Tremblay, who occasionally slapped me on the back of the head while in flight when he was unimpressed with my flying. At times I thought I would never become a professional pilot, let alone a pilot at all. My first solo flight was made in early October. I still remember that special day. After half an hour in the air practicing takeoffs and landings, touch and go, with my instructor Mr. Tremblay beside me, he ordered me to land and taxi to the parking area. I didn't understand what was going on. My instructor got out of the plane and told me to perform a solo touch and go. This meant that I would taxi to the runway, take off, climb to 1,000 feet, turn around, land on the same runway, and return to the aircraft parking. I taxied towards the runway, alone in the plane, alone at the control, alone with my thoughts, and so damn excited. The control tower cleared me for takeoff. I pushed the throttle forward and accelerated to takeoff speed. I started climbing towards the sky. I felt slightly puzzled because a small plane taking off with two behaves quite differently than with one. I still remember with pride the takeoff, climbing, descending and landing. I remember arriving in front of the terminal. After the engine was shut down and the end of flight checklist completed, the other students were waiting for me. They poured a bucket of water over my head to mark my first solo flight. I was now a real pilot. Tragic collision, Tabernac. When I returned to flight school in September 1979, I excitedly continued my courses to become an airline pilot. We had many weekly hours of theory in class. In between classes, we flew with our flight instructors. We also flew solo on the single-engine planes. We would go to the training area to practice flying skills, spins, steep turns, engine failures, and other training exercises. One day, two Beechcraft B-19s crashed into each other. My roommate Bernie left student aviation forever at the end of that semester. He had witnessed a horrific mid-air collision. On that beautiful day in September, a Thursday to be precise, there were about 10 students who were all practicing flying Beechcraft B-19s. Some students were flying a fair distance away. They were practicing navigating, following flight charts, recognizing cities, roads, mountains, rivers, and other signs on the VFR, Visual Flight Rules, aeronautical charts. But before takeoff, Bernie, our two friends Germain and Danielle, and myself had decided to communicate with each other by VHF radio once in flight so we could have some fun. Bernie and Germain decided to make passes under each other, in other words, playing leapfrog in the air. I was a few nautical miles away doing my own tricks with Daniel. As Germain was passing under Bernie's plane, the pilot Francois, unaware of the game, was returning from a flight around Lac Saint-Jean. Francois' plane sideswiped Germain's plane at a 45-degree angle, losing a wing. Each plane went crashing to the ground. Immediately, the pilot of one of the other planes radioed the airport control tower and said there had been an accident. The air traffic controller began to contact all the aircraft in flight. Controller, Golf Uniform, Golf November, Sendor Air, Tower here. Pilot, this is Golf Uniform, Golf November. Controller, Foxtrot Echo, Quebec Charlie, Sendor Air, Tower here. Pilot, this is Foxtrot Echo, Quebec Charlie. The communication continued until the two crashed planes were identified. The Sendor Air control tower ordered all aircraft to return to base. As I was less than 2,000 feet above the accident site, the controller asked me to fly over the accident area until the arrival of the Canadian Army helicopters. I circled the crash site for approximately 10 minutes until I saw the Canadian Army CH-146 Griffon Bell helicopters arrive. I headed back to the airport. I was in control of my airplane, but I thought to myself that if I panicked and lost control, I'd crash and die. This was a first for me. I was going through the motions of flying, trying to keep clear-headed, but my mind was obsessed by the fact that I'd just witnessed a tragedy. Clearly, I was afraid to let my emotions take over and lose it. After landing, I parked my airplane in the line with the other planes on the tarmac. I saw Bernie was still in his plane. When he saw me, he got out of his plane and fell immediately to the ground, sobbing. I slowly pulled him up and we walked away together towards the terminal. The bus that brought the student pilots back from lunch arrived at the same time, and everyone surrounded us, demanding to know what had happened. Bernie had witnessed everything. He had been less than 50 feet away when the crash occurred. His plane was literally drenched with fuel and pieces of metal. Bernie lied and told the director of the flight school that he'd been 1,000 meters away when the other two planes collided. The director said that Bernie's implausible story didn't make sense. Just as Bernie was finally ready to tell the truth, the disgusted director told Bernie that their meeting was over. To this day, only 3 people know what really happened: Bernie, Daniel, and I. The final report explained that Germain was practicing spins when he hit Francois, who was returning from a navigation training flight. In those days, the flight college training area was too small, and the risk of an accident was quite high. Following this tragedy, the training area was enlarged considerably. I found out several years later that Bernie had become the mayor of a town in western Quebec. 6 days after this accident, I was forced to fly with an instructor to prove that I was feeling mentally well enough to continue my flight training. Coffee, tea, or mushrooms, running into drugs. At the end of that infamous month, the college offered some of us students a trip to the Montreal airport for a visit to Air Canada. It was a crazy weekend where alcohol and marijuana were readily available. Third-year students had gone to Montreal on the bus, along with some flight instructors from the college. Our friend's fatal crash was finally behind us. At Air Canada, we had the chance to fly the Douglas DC-8 flight simulator. The 250-passenger Douglas DC-8 is no longer in service, but it was a major workhorse in its day. During my last 2 winters at flight school, I took a training course with the Canadian Ski Patrol. I skied with my cousin Gilles, roommate Bernie, and another student pilot, Richard Lalonde. We were on the ski patrol at Mount Clerval, a small mountain a few miles from our home in Chicoutimi. There had probably been more skiing accidents on that mountain involving the patrollers than regular skiers. We were not what one might call very professional in our behaviour. Still, we had a great time on those slopes and at the little chalet at the bottom of the mountain. I was beginning my 3rd year at flight school. I worked for a few days at my father's alarm company. I was a technician installing alarm systems in my hometown of Magog. While having lunch at my father's house, my cousin Gilles arrived unexpectedly. He had just returned from a long trip in the Maritimes with magic mushrooms. Gilles had picked these hallucinogenic beauties while on his trip and had hoped to sell them back here in Quebec. On the kitchen table, he separated the mushrooms and put them into small bags. Pieces of mushrooms would fall on the floor, and I would pick them up and put them back on the table. Of course, some ended up in my mouth. After helping my cousin for a while, I had to go back to work. I left in my father's company truck. Gilles also drove home, which was a few hours away. I was driving to my next client when suddenly the few tiny pieces of mushrooms I had eaten took effect. I stopped the truck right in the middle of the street, opened the front door, leaving it ajar, and sat on the sidewalk. Suffering from the hallucinogenic effects of the mushrooms, I couldn't move. Lucky me, nobody around, and especially no policeman. After what seemed like a lifetime, but was in fact about 30 minutes, I'd had enough strength to stand up. I got back into the truck and drove home. I called my father, telling him that I was not well and could not continue working. I'd been very fortunate to get away with this little misadventure. No more magic mushrooms for me.